Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. The world of Harry Potter seems carefully structured. Strict laws of magic, clear rules for spells, boundaries of what is allowed and what is impossible. But if you look more closely, you'll notice that the books and movies themselves often broke these rules, sometimes so cleverly that most fans never noticed the trick. Time paradoxes, forgotten magical laws, illogical punishments. Let's look at the most striking cases where the Potter universe contradicted itself. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Thestrals. Luna Lovegood explains to Harry that Thestrals can only be seen by those who have witnessed death with their own eyes. For her, it was the tragic loss of her mother. For Harry, it was Cedric Diggory's death. It all seems coherent and logical, but the inconsistencies appear immediately. In Philosopher's Stone, Harry witnessed Quirrell's death when he fell, unable to withstand the magic. As a baby, he also saw his mother die at Voldemort's hand. Yes, the memory was erased, but the visual contact happened. So why did Thestrals only reveal themselves to him in the 5th book? Number 2. The Portkey. Magical Portkeys come in 2 types. Some are activated by touch and transport to a predetermined location, while others work at a specific time, like a train on schedule. After use, they become harmless, so a muggle doesn't accidentally activate them. But in Goblet of Fire, the Portkey suddenly breaks all the rules. Not only does it take Harry to Voldemort, but it also brings him back to Hogwarts. What's more, it drops him off somewhere other than where he departed. Nothing in magical law allows for this kind of behavior. Number 3. The Trace. The Ministry's trace seemed like a sensible idea, to monitor underage wizards so they don't use magic outside school, but in practice, the system looked absurd. Spells are tracked not by the individual, but by the area where they live. Ron could cast spells at home freely, since his whole family used magic anyway. But Harry got blamed for anything like Dobby's magic. But then what stopped Draco Malfoy from casting spells on Privet Drive just to frame Harry? The system was also wildly inconsistent. Harry was nearly expelled for using a Patronus, but when Nymphadora Tonks cast magic right in his bedroom, no letter ever came. And what about the Lumos in Prisoner of Azkaban, which Harry uses with no consequence? Number 4. The Patronus and the Bogart. Professor Lupin's first lesson taught students to defeat a boggart with laughter. It made sense, since the creature is just a reflection of fear. But soon after, Lupin used a boggart in the form of a Dementor to help Harry practice the Patronus charm. Here's the oddity. A boggart isn't a real Dementor, so it shouldn't have caused the same horrifying effects. Yet Harry could barely stand, heard his mother's voice, and lost strength, as if facing a real Dementor. Moreover, the Patronus became a weapon against a boggart, when logically the spell should have been no more than a toy for it. Number 5. The punishment for escaping Azkaban. The Dementor's kiss, the draining of the soul, is considered the most terrifying punishment in the wizarding world. Canonically, it was meant for those who committed the worst crimes, and above all, for those who escaped from Azkaban. Sirius Black somehow avoided this fate, but Barty Crouch Jr. was sentenced to it, yet other Death Eaters who escaped in 1996 were simply put back into cells after being caught. They were never kissed. In 1997, they escaped again, and looked perfectly fine. So where was the promised severity of the punishment? Number 6. Apparition in Hogwarts. Impossible. Except when it's not. From the very beginning, the rule is absolute. No one can apparate or disapparate inside the castle grounds. It is Dumbledore himself who insists on this protection, making Hogwarts a fortress against intrusion. Yet cracks appear almost immediately. House elves like Dobby click their fingers and vanish from kitchens and dormitories without trouble. Their magic, we are told, is somehow different. But if safety rests on an anti-apparition charm, why should exceptions exist at all? The rule feels less like unbreakable law and more like a guideline to be bent when convenient. The films blur the line even further. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore apparates with Harry straight off the astronomy tower, ignoring the ban altogether. Later, Death Eaters swirl into Hogwarts in clouds of black smoke, a spectacle that looks suspiciously like mass apparition. Viewers are left asking, is the rule still in place, or has it been quietly abandoned? If the defense of the school can be sidestepped by style or species, then the great magical barrier is not a law, it is a stage prop, shifting to fit the scene. Number 7, the Marauder's map, shows everyone except when it doesn't. The Marauder's map is introduced as flawless. It shows every person in the castle, Lupin explains, handing it to Harry in Prisoner of Azkaban. Every step, every name, no matter how well hidden, is supposed to appear on its parchment. Yet the very same map hides the truth for years. Fred and George use it constantly but never question why Peter Pettigrew sleeps beside their little brother at night. They must have seen the name countless times. They must have asked themselves who this stranger was, and yet nothing. The greatest secret of the story lies in plain sight, unnoticed. The inconsistency deepens with Barty Crouch Jr. in Goblet of Fire. He spends months disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, teaching classes and fooling the entire staff. But if Harry had opened the map, it should have revealed the truth. It would not write Moody, it would have written Barty Crouch Jr. in bold letters. The map is too precise to be tricked by Polyjuice potion, and yet Rowling keeps this detail hidden as though the map suddenly loses its power until the dramatic reveal is due. What emerges is selective magic. Sometimes the Marauder's map is an all-seeing eye. Sometimes it is blind. The rule is clear when it serves the story, but discarded when it threatens to spoil the twist. It becomes not a reliable artifact, but a narrative device that bends under pressure. The same tool that once exposed secrets is also guilty of keeping them, and the choice of what it shows feels less like wizardry and more like convenience. Number 8. Polyjuice potion in the books. It doesn't change voice or clothes. In the films it does. In Chamber of Secrets, the rules of Polyjuice potion are clear. When Harry and Ron transform into Crabbe and Goyle, their bodies change, but their voices remain the same. "We'll have to sound like them," Harry warns, and both boys practice mimicking the Slytherin's tone. They even steal robes to match the disguise because the potion doesn't supply clothes. The magic is powerful, but limited. Rowling makes sure we understand that imitation requires preparation, not just swallowing a brew. The films rewrite the law for convenience. In the movie version, the transformation is total. When Barty Crouch Jr. uses Polyjuice to impersonate Mad-Eye Moody, he not only looks identical, but also speaks in Moody's gravelly growl. Even Harry, disguised as Goyle, has his voice altered. The potion goes further, reshaping clothes and mannerisms. Suddenly Polyjuice becomes a complete identity swap, no effort required. It looks spectacular, but it contradicts the canon. The change raises questions the story never answers. If the potion can alter voice and outfit, why bother with stolen hairs or strict brewing rules? Why did Harry and Ron need to plan so carefully in the book when a cinematic gulp could have solved everything? The films erase the cleverness and discipline that the potion once demanded. What should have been a test of wit becomes a shortcut, reminding us that sometimes spectacle comes at the cost of the world's own consistency. Number 9. Gamp's Law and Food out of thin air. Gamp's Law is supposed to set limits on magic. In Deathly Hallows, Hermione explains it with certainty. Food is one of the 5 principal exceptions to Gamp's Law of elemental transfiguration. You can't make it out of thin air. Wizards can summon food, multiply it, or transform what already exists, but they cannot conjure it from nothing. The rule is meant to show that even in a world of miracles, some boundaries cannot be crossed. Yet the films constantly blur this line. In Sorcerer's Stone, the Great Hall, feasts appear in dazzling flashes, as though the meals were created by a spell. Later, at Slughorn's Christmas party in Half-Blood Prince, plates fill with hors d'oeuvres as if by magic. For viewers, it looks like food is produced directly from nowhere. The rule Hermione stresses, one of the cornerstones of magical lore, seems ignored for the sake of spectacle. The contradiction is subtle, but once noticed, it is impossible to unsee. Water complicates the picture further. In Goblet of Fire, Dumbledore conjures goblets of water for Harry and the Weasleys after the graveyard ordeal. In Half-Blood Prince, we watch Dumbledore summon clear streams with aguamenti. If water is not food, then why does it escape the logic of Gamp's law? Where exactly does the boundary lie? Wizards can apparently generate endless liquid, but not a loaf of bread. The inconsistency raises questions. If survival is at stake, why can water be produced indefinitely, but not even a crumb of food? The books try to cover this with practical explanations. House elves cook in vast kitchens hidden beneath the Great Hall, then send the meals upward. This detail grounds the law and keeps the rule intact. But the films lean towards spectacle. Banquets materialize, tables fill instantly, and the audience is left to assume magic creates it all. Gamp's law begins as a hard boundary in the text, yet, in the visual version of the story, it bends until it almost disappears. The difference leaves fans wondering whether the limits of magic were ever truly limits at all. Number 10. Avada Kedavra, the unblockable. Curse that gets blocked on screen. Avada Kedavra is introduced with absolute clarity. There is no counter-curse, says Moody in Goblet of Fire, demonstrating it on a spider. Green light, instant death. The lesson is terrifying. If the killing curse is cast, the only hope is to dodge. Protego cannot block it, and even the most skilled wizard should fear it. That rule sets the stakes. Voldemort's followers are dangerous not because of numbers, but because they wield a spell that cannot be stopped. Yet the films weaken that promise. In Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore battles Voldemort in the Ministry. Green bolts of Avada Kedavra smash against statues, swirl against streams of water, and even appear to collide with fiery attacks. The scene is breathtaking, but it changes the rules. If a spell meant to pierce any defense can be blocked by animated stone or magical barriers, then its uniqueness fades. The killing curse becomes just another beam in a colorful duel. The inconsistency grows in Deathly Hallows. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Voldemort unleashes Avada Kedavra across the Great Hall. Instead of cutting through defenses, the curse ricochets, splashes against shields, and is swallowed by bursts of light. The final confrontation between Harry and Voldemort reduces the curse to a tug-of-war of green and red, like two jets colliding mid-air. But that is not how it was ever described in the books. Harry himself once said in Half-Blood Prince, "You can't block it. There's nothing you can do against it." What was supposed to be the ultimate terror becomes a special effect. The fear of Avada Kedavra lies in its inevitability, in the knowledge that no shield can save you. By letting cinematic duels turn it into a beam that can be parried, the films rob the spell of its myth. The unblockable curse becomes a hollow slogan, more theatre than truth. In the end, Voldemort's greatest weapon loses its edge not in battle, but in contradiction. Number 11. The Time Turners, magic. Everyone forgets about after one book. The Time Turner enters the story like a miracle. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Hermione uses it to attend multiple classes at once. Then in the climax, she and Harry travel back on just 3 hours. The result is extraordinary. They save Buckbeak from execution, free Sirius Black from the tower, and watch events fold into a perfect loop. "What we've done is the only thing that could have been done," Dumbledore explains. The Time Turner is presented as flawless magic. Dangerous, yes, but precise and reliable. And then it disappears. In Goblet of Fire, when Cedric Diggory dies, no one suggests going back even a few minutes. In Order of the Phoenix, when Sirius falls through the veil, there is no talk of reversing time. The grief is raw, but the solution that once worked is treated as though it never existed. Fans noticed this silence. If Buckbeak was worth the risk, why not Cedric, Sirius, or even Dumbledore? The story never answers, and the silence feels deliberate. Rowling tries to close the gap. In Half-Blood Prince, it is mentioned that the Ministry's stock of time-turners was destroyed during a battle. The explanation feels thin, almost apologetic. One shattered cabinet and an entire branch of magic is gone forever. But the idea lingers. Wizards rebuild wands, cauldrons, and magical artifacts constantly. Why should time-turners be beyond repair? A tool powerful enough to reshape history vanishes with a single throwaway line. The contradiction is glaring. When it suits the plot, the time-turner is the key to victory. When it threatens to unravel the stakes of future stories, it is quietly erased. The rules shift from time travel is possible, but dangerous, to time travel never existed. Readers are left with an uneasy feeling. If the wizarding world truly possessed a way to alter destiny, why would anyone ever stop at just saving Buckbeak? The time-turner proves that sometimes the greatest hole in the story is created by magic that is simply too strong to be allowed to live. Number 12. Wand ownership. The wand chooses the wizard, until the plot chooses otherwise. The wand chooses the wizard, Ollivander tells Harry in The Sorcerer's Stone. It feels like a sacred law of the wizarding world. A borrowed wand will work, but never as well as the one that truly belongs to you. This is why Harry struggles when he tries to use Hermione's wand, and why Voldemort is furious when the Elder Wand refuses to perform for him. The rule seems simple, until the story begins to twist it. By the time we reach the Deathly Hallows, we learn a new condition. A wand can switch allegiance if its master is defeated. Draco disarms Dumbledore at the top of the astronomy tower, and from that moment the Elder Wand belongs to Draco, even though he never uses it. The idea is striking. The wand responds not to ownership, but to power. The logic feels clear until Rowling adds yet another layer. Harry later disarms Draco at Malfoy Manor with a simple Expelliarmus. No duel to the death, no grand ritual, just a schoolboy's reflex. And yet that small action shifts the loyalty of the Elder Wand once more. The Elder Wand recognized a new master, Dumbledore's portrait explains. What began as a mystical bond between wizard and wand now looks like a chain of accidents passed along with every dropped wand and shouted spell. This is why the climactic duel feels almost absurd. Voldemort unleashes the killing curse, confident the Elder Wand will obey him. Harry responds with his old standby, Expelliarmus. And the wand, loyal to Harry through a tangle of technicalities, betrays its dark owner. The moment is dramatic, but the rules that lead to it feel shaky. What started as a timeless truth, the wand chooses the wizard, becomes a patchwork of exceptions rewritten to deliver the ending the story needed. Number 13, Petrificus Totalus, works differently every time. Of all the spells in J.K. Rowling's wizarding world, few are as simple and effective as the full body-bind curse, Petrificus Totalus. The incantation is introduced in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and from the very first time it appears, it is presented as an uncompromising force. Absolute paralysis, a living statue, the victim crashing to the floor, unable even to twitch a finger. The power of that moment is etched into every reader's memory. Hermione, desperate to stop Neville Longbottom from interfering with the trio's mission to protect the Philosopher's Stone, points her wand, shouts the incantation, and in an instant Neville stiffens, like a board, and fell flat on his face. The description is unambiguous. The spell leaves no room for subtle interpretation. It is total control over the body, no loopholes, no partial effects. The rules are simple, and the scene demonstrates them perfectly. Yet, as the saga unfolded in later books, and especially in the film adaptations, those rules began to bend, crack, and eventually collapse into inconsistency. The memory of Neville frozen on the Gryffindor common room floor is powerful because it sets the benchmark for how Petrificus Totalus is supposed to function. Rowling herself defines its impact in crystal clarity. The victim cannot move, cannot resist, cannot act. The curse does not merely hinder, but utterly dominates. In storytelling terms, the spell is a weapon of desperation, used when one character must stop another instantly and completely. That narrative clarity is crucial because once such rules are established, they must either remain consistent or evolve through explanation. But in the Harry Potter series, the curse drifts away from its own foundation, becoming a tool that operates differently depending on convenience. What began as a devastating magical lock sometimes appears later as a mere stumbling block, as if the writers could not decide whether it was a hammer or a feather. Tweaky. The inconsistency first shows itself in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. During the dueling club scene, Gilderoy Lockhart organizes a demonstration between Harry and Draco Malfoy. Although the focus is on Expelliarmus and the sudden arrival of the conjured snake, the full body bind is mentioned as one of the many spells that might appear in a duel. Yet in that very sequence, chaos erupts and students throw curses across the platform, some of which seem to partially restrain, others that only push opponents back. Nowhere do we see the stark, stone-like immobilization of Neville. Already, the spell is drifting into a less absolute territory, its terrifying rigidity blunted by vague portrayal. The books mention it as though it remains unchanged, but the cinematic representation reduces its clarity, letting victims show signs of resistance or partial mobility. The problem is not simply cinematic flair, it creates a fracture in how audiences perceive the very laws of magic. By the time Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire reaches its climax, the inconsistency deepens. At the graveyard where Voldemort regains his body, Death Eaters arrive to witness his resurrection. The duel between Voldemort and Harry is described in haunting detail. Yet earlier, when Harry had been captured and bound, spells were used on him to restrict his movement, but never the full body bind. Here is where the confusion grows. If Petrificus Totalus is truly an immobilization spell beyond question, why not use it? The answer lies not in the logic of the wizarding world, but in narrative convenience. Rowling needed Harry to retain just enough freedom of movement to take part in the duel. The curse is forgotten because it would break the story. Its rules are too strong for the needs of the plot, so the spell vanishes when inconvenient, despite its earlier prominence. The films amplify this selective amnesia. Consider Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. In the Ministry of Magic battle, where Death Eaters and members of Dumbledore's army clash in chaos, the full body bind makes sporadic appearances, but its impact is inconsistent. In one frame, a victim stiffens for a second, only to fall aside with their eyes darting wildly. In another, the effect seems to last mere moments before dissipating without any countercurse like finite incantatum. Bellatrix Lestrange herself provides perhaps the most glaring example. When attacked, she does not collapse like Neville, paralyzed from head to toe. Instead, she resists, writhes, and within seconds continues fighting as if shaken but not destroyed. For a spell defined as total paralysis, this is a betrayal of its very identity. It works only when the plot demands, otherwise becoming a paper wall for more dramatic magic. The contrast between Hermione's ruthless use of the curse on Neville and its flimsy effect on Bellatrix is almost comical. How can a first-year student's spell reduce a boy to a living plank, yet experienced fighters barely falter when struck? The discrepancy is never addressed in the narrative. No professor explains that stronger wizards can resist it. No textbook correction suggests that the spell's power varies by caster. Readers and viewers are left in silence, forced to accept two completely different portrayals of the same magic. This is where the immersion breaks. The Harry Potter series builds itself on the promise that its world obeys internal laws, but here the laws crumble under the weight of convenience. And the audience, hungry for spectacle, often fails to notice the fracture. Number 14. Flying without a broom. Rare talent or common trick? Of all the inconsistencies that lurk within the world of Harry Potter, few are as quietly disruptive as the question of flight without a broom. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, J.K. Rowling builds tension during the climactic duel in the Ministry of Magic when Harry sees something chilling, Voldemort himself rising from the ground and moving through the air with no visible aid. Rowling's words cut with precision. Voldemort was moving, not walking, but flying, without broomstick or Thestral, as though suspended in mid-air. This moment is written with such sharp detail that the reader is meant to gasp to understand immediately. That this ability is rare, terrifying, and reserved only for the Dark Lord himself. It is no accident that Rowling frames the scene this way. Flight without magical tools is supposed to be unsettling because it violates everything wizards have told us about how magic works. But the films, and later even Rowling's choices in the wider canon, chip away at this uniqueness until the moment loses much of its intended power. The contrast becomes even starker in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Part 1, when the screen adaptation gives us a different image of Voldemort's followers. Instead of simply apparating, flue-travelling, or even flying on broomsticks, the Death Eaters transform into trails of black smoke that glide across the sky over London. The visuals are dramatic, cinematic, and undeniably memorable. Bellatrix Lestrange, Lucius Malfoy, Yaxley, and others all appear with the same dark vapour effect. The camera sweeps across the city as though London has become a battlefield of shadow and fire. But here the problem reveals itself. How can Voldemort's unique and terrifying ability from one installment suddenly become commonplace, an aesthetic choice for an entire squad? By elevating the followers to the same method of transport, the films erase the careful boundary that Rowling drew between Voldemort's inhuman gifts and the standard magic available to the rest of the wizarding world. The books themselves take great care to emphasize how unusual Voldemort's skill truly is. In Deathly Hallows, Snape is described flying like a great black bat, soaring away from the Hogwarts gates without broomstick or beast. When Harry sees it, he immediately recognizes the parallel. He can fly. Voldemort can fly. This repeated recognition drives home how unnatural the magic is, how it belongs only to the most formidable wizards, and even then, barely anyone besides Voldemort has achieved it. Rowling even connects this ability to Voldemort's obsession with transcending human limits. His flight is not just physical but symbolic, a rejection of the rules that bind others, just as he has rejected death itself. And yet the films dilute this symbolism by making Death Eaters swarm like wasps, all enjoying the same skill. Consider the careful groundwork Rowling lays when describing the limits of magical transport. Apparition is taught in the 6th year at Hogwarts with strict rules, requiring licensing, concentration, and skill. Broomsticks have weighty cultural value, not only for Quidditch, but for personal travel, and enchanted creatures like Thestrals and hippogriffs emphasize dependence on magical beasts. Even flue powder has precise instructions and comical consequences if misused. Each method has boundaries, reinforcing the idea that wizards are powerful, but not limitless. Against this backdrop, Voldemort's flight becomes a violation of structure itself, and that is what makes it frightening. By contrast, when the films casually grant the same power to a crowd of Death Eaters, they quietly dismantle Rowling's rules without explanation. It is worth remembering how Harry himself reacts to Voldemort's abilities. In Deathly Hallows, during the Seven Potters chase, Voldemort flies alongside Harry's broom, closing in with predatory speed. Rowling describes Harry's horror at seeing the Dark Lord pursue him like a phantom. The shock in Harry's mind is not just about the danger, but about the impossibility of what he is witnessing. Voldemort is cheating the laws of magic. He was flying without support, without broomstick. Thestral, his snake-like face gleaming out of the blackness. Harry knows instantly this is no normal feat, and that knowledge intensifies the terror of being hunted. If every Death Eater could do the same, the moment would lose its meaning. The fear stems from Voldemort alone having this unnatural dominance over the air. The cinematic decision to let Death Eaters trail smoke might be forgiven as visual metaphor, but the films lean too heavily into it as literal. Bellatrix darts above the city in flames of shadow, circling like a bird of prey. Lucius Malfoy appears and vanishes in curling tendrils of darkness. Yaxley chases targets as if he too has mastered the forbidden art of free flight. The effect is striking on the screen, but it undermines the earlier narrative emphasis that Voldemort's personal gift is extraordinary. Instead of Voldemort appearing singular and terrifying, he blends into his army, merely another figure swirling in the storm. Rowling herself makes this rarity central when Dumbledore confronts Voldemort at the Ministry. Dumbledore, whose power and wisdom are unparalleled, never attempts flight without aid. His mastery lies in spells, wards, and combat skill. The fact that even Dumbledore refrains from such an act signals that it belongs to Voldemort alone. Rowling draws a clean line. Here is magic that Dumbledore does not imitate, a sign of Voldemort's obsession with unnatural power. The reader feels instinctively that the Dark Lord has crossed into something abnormal, a distortion of magic that few dare touch. This line in the sand collapses when the films blur the power across multiple characters. Number 15, Fiendfire uncontrollable, except when it's controlled. Of all the contradictions in the Harry Potter saga, few are as glaring as the treatment of fire. In the books, fire is not a simple tool. It is not a spark conjured for light, nor a convenient flame used for theatrics. When J.K. Rowling describes Fiendfire, she paints it as a nightmare given form, a monstrous conflagration, alive and ravenous, that devours everything in its path. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, when Crabbe unleashes Fiendfire inside the Room of Requirement, the prose is visceral. Rowling writes that it was a great wave of crimson fire which broke over them like a tidal wave, billowing and sweltering, filled with the shapes of gigantic beasts. That description seals its place as one of the most dangerous, magical forces in the wizarding world. It is unstoppable, it is untamable, and it consumes even the Horcruxes themselves, the very objects designed to resist destruction. This is the canon foundation. Fire in this form is chaos itself. Yet when one moves from the printed page to the cinematic adaptation, something shifts. Fire ceases to be wild, ceases to be a danger, and becomes something else entirely. It becomes pliable, almost playful, as though wizards merely coax flames into shape. Think of Dumbledore in the Order of the Phoenix film, conjuring a fiery lasso to battle Voldemort in the Ministry of Magic. The flames bend at his command, tame as serpents charmed by music. Or McGonagall in the Half-Blood Prince film, where her wand ignites torches and creates controlled bursts of fire as easily as breathing. These cinematic images are striking, yes, but they reveal an inconsistency. Is fire a raw, ancient terror, or is it merely another tool for spectacle? The books warned us that Fiendfire was nearly impossible to control, but the films seem determined to show the opposite. Consider again the Fiendfire scene itself. In the Deathly Hallows book, Crabbe's mistake is fatal precisely because he cannot rein in the fire. Rowling emphasizes the futility of control, describing it as out of control, a fire more fierce than any normal blaze with a will of its own. It is this quality that makes the scene so terrifying. Harry, Hermione, and Ron are helpless, scrambling not to extinguish, but merely to escape. Crabbe, consumed by his own conjuration, meets his end in its jaws. The tragedy underscores a larger theme. Some magics should never be meddled with because they are stronger than any wizard's pride. This is a consistent moral point in the narrative, yet when the same moment is visualized on screen, the Fiendfire manifests as a CGI beast that looks terrifying but seems more like a conjured dragon than a storm. Even as it swirls, its movements seem choreographed, as if hinting that it could be wielded by a skilled hand. The danger is diluted by spectacle. The contrast becomes sharper when compared with earlier cinematic uses of fire. In Goblet of Fire, for example, the Hungarian horntail chase involves fire erupting from the dragon's maw, which Harry narrowly avoids. The fire here is thrilling, but also precise, almost like a weapon guided directly at him. Later in the same film, during the Death Eater rampage at the Quidditch World Cup, the Marauders ignite tents and send flames rolling across the encampment. Yet these fires, too, are strangely selective, burning as the plot requires, not as an uncontrollable disaster. In moments like these, the rules of Rowling's world bend. Flames in the cinematic universe are no longer the devouring, indiscriminate force described in the books, but a convenient special effect, manageable and predictable. It is important to remember that Rowling herself planted seeds of fire's duality in the books. Hermione's bluebell flames, for example, appear several times. These small, contained fires are conjured in jars, harmless to friends, but still effective against enemies. In Sorcerer's Stone, Hermione uses her bluebell flames against Devil's Snare, proving fire's protective and useful qualities. Rowling distinguishes between these minor magical fires and Fiendfire. The distinction is crucial. Hermione's fire is a charm, domesticated and safe. Fiendfire is cursed fire, ancient and wild. The book makes this boundary clear, but in the films this nuance is blurred. All fire appears equally malleable. All conjured flames seem like paint on a canvas. Thus, when Fiendfire finally appears, the audience is not prepared for the chasm of difference. It is framed as just another flame taken to the extreme, not as a unique, forbidden category of magic. This contradiction does not merely reflect artistic choice, it also affects the stakes of the story. When Harry faces Fiendfire in the book, the scene works because it feels inevitable, apocalyptic. The fire is not simply dangerous, it is absolute. It closes in with the inevitability of death itself, and the only solution is flight. This is why the destruction of the Horcrux locket feels earned. As Rowling describes, the diadem was flung into the air by a spout of fire and broke apart as it hit the stone floor, smoke issuing from the crack. The point is that only something so rare and uncontrollable could have undone the Horcrux, but when the audience has been shown for years that fire can be sculpted and dismissed at will, that message falters. The diadem's destruction risks feeling like narrative convenience rather than the horrifying price of meddling with forbidden magic. Number 16, potions. From a month of brewing to 5 minutes in class. Of all the many contradictions between the Harry Potter books and their cinematic adaptations, few are as striking as the treatment of potions. In the novels, potion making is a delicate art, almost a scientific ritual requiring time, patience, precision, and rare ingredients. It is not simply about tossing a few items into a cauldron and stirring. J.K. Rowling establishes this discipline as one of the most exacting branches of magic, the one subject where natural wand talent does not determine success, but rather meticulous practice, sharp memory, close attention to detail. Yet in the films, this discipline is often reduced to a quick classroom scene where students casually brew complex concoctions within an hour's lesson. The essence of potions as magical chemistry is diminished, turning a months-long process into something that can be accomplished between bells. One of the clearest illustrations of this tension is the Polyjuice potion, known in Russian as the oborotnoye zelya. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Hermione explains to Harry and Ron that the potion requires not only extremely difficult preparation, but also a full month to mature. The book states the Polyjuice potion couldn't be made in less than a month. It needed to stew for 21 days before it was ready. Rowling emphasizes the long wait, the care with which Hermione hides the cauldron in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, and the way the trio anxiously counts the days before they can use it. This passage makes clear that potion making is never a matter of improvisation or speed. It reflects the way real chemistry demands careful timing, controlled conditions and patience, but in the films, this entire dimension is stripped away. The brewing appears compressed into a montage of ingredients thrown together, and the notion of 30 days of waiting vanishes from the audience's mind. For viewers who never read the books, potion making seems like a quick fix rather than a discipline of endurance. This compression has consequences for how audiences perceive Severus Snape as a teacher. In the books, Snape's cruelty lies not in making impossible demands within a single class period, but in holding students to the highest of standards in a subject that already requires years of practice. He snarls at Harry, "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making. As there is little foolish wand-waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic." Rowling carefully crafts the impression that Snape is the guardian of a dangerous and exacting art. Every ingredient matters, every timing must be followed, but the films distort this subtlety by showing Snape barking orders and expecting students to whip up complex brews before the bell rings. This makes him seem more like an unreasonable taskmaster than the stern keeper of a sacred craft. The nuance of his authority is lost because the foundational rules of potion making are ignored. The case of Felix Felicis, the famous liquid luck, is another moment where film logic diverges dramatically from book logic. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Professor Slughorn introduces Felix Felicis as an incredibly rare, almost unattainable potion. Rowling describes it in vivid terms. It is a complicated potion and extremely time-consuming to make. Desperate for supplies, the Ministry has banned its mass production. Slughorn even admits that to brew it perfectly requires extraordinary skill and precision. In the book, the rarity of Felix underlines the significance of Harry. Winning a vial of it during class, and it explains why the potion cannot be casually brewed by any Hogwarts student. But in the film adaptation, this sense of difficulty disappears. Felix Felicis is presented almost like a standard prize, something sitting ready on Slughorn's desk, shimmering and golden, with little acknowledgement of the months of brewing that would be required to produce such a thing. For viewers unfamiliar with the novel, the potion seems no rarer than a fancy snack, and the long tradition of potion brewing as grueling work vanishes. The symbolic weight of potion making is also undermined by these shortcuts. In Rowling's world, potions symbolize the power of persistence, discipline, and hidden knowledge. The act of brewing a potion reflects human qualities of patience and respect for process. When Hermione labors for weeks over the Polyjuice potion, we see her personality embodied, precise, hard-working, determined. The long brewing time is part of her character arc. Stripping away the labor and compressing the process removes this character-building layer. Hermione's hidden work in Myrtle's bathroom was more than an act of rebellion. It was an apprenticeship in responsibility. Without the month-long wait, that symbolism evaporates, and with it, part of Hermione's journey. There are smaller inconsistencies scattered throughout the films as well. In the book Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape provides Harry with instructions from the Half-Blood Prince's copy of Advanced Potion Making. The notes describe detailed improvements to recipes such as crushing a saprophoros bean rather than cutting it to release its juice more effectively. This reflects the spirit of potions as a field where tiny details can transform the outcome. It mirrors real-world science, where a small methodological change can revolutionize results. But in the film, this careful artistry becomes little more than scribbles in a textbook that magically make Harry better than his peers. The scientific nuance, the idea that careful innovation can improve centuries-old methods, disappears, replaced by the implication that a student can cheat their way to mastery with a lucky textbook. The films also reduce the narrative role of potion ingredients themselves. In the books, Rowling relishes the names of rare plants and animal parts, boomslang skin, fluxweed, lacewing flies, bezoars. These ingredients carry history, folklore, and danger. She grounds potion making in an ecology of magical flora and fauna, suggesting a wider world of harvesting, trade, and black markets. Consider the moment when Snape saves Ron in Half-Blood Prince by shoving a bezoar down his throat. The book had introduced bezoars much earlier, during Harry's very first potions lesson, establishing Chekhov's gun that would later save a life. In the film, the ingredient appears abruptly, without the same layered history, stripping the story of its careful setup. Without the web of rare ingredients and their background, potion making feels detached from the wider magical world. This reduction is more than a matter of detail. It changes how we understand magic itself. Rowling constructs magic not as something instantly conjured, but as something earned, learned, and built through discipline. A spell may be cast in a second, but a potion takes weeks. Magic is not always about speed, but about knowledge. When the films ignore this, they lean toward portraying magic as effortless spectacle rather than disciplined craft. The audience then misses one of Rowling's underlying themes. That hard work often matters more than raw talent. Potions in the books embody that lesson. The films, by making them look quick and easy, undermine the theme itself. It is worth remembering that the complexity of potion making also served narrative tension. The month-long brewing of Polyjuice created suspense in Chamber of Secrets. The time delay raised the stakes. The trio could not simply change forms whenever they pleased. They had to plan, wait, and risk discovery in the meantime. This narrative mechanic disappears in the film. By showing only the final result, the tension of time evaporates. What could have been a story of patience and stealth becomes merely a sequence of quick disguises. The audience loses not only world-building detail, but also dramatic momentum. The shift also affects the perception of the wider magical community. In the novels, skilled potion makers are rare and valued. Horace Slughorn's reputation, for instance, rests partly on his mastery of advanced potions. He is not merely a social butterfly, but someone who has achieved in a field where few can. The prestige of Felix Felicis underlines this point. Not just anyone could make it. In the films, however, potion mastery seems commonplace, as if all Hogwarts students could, given a bit of luck, whip up a batch of liquid luck. This diminishes the uniqueness of characters like Slughorn and Snape, flattening their roles in the magical hierarchy. Even Voldemort's story loses resonance under this cinematic simplification. In Half-Blood Prince, we see young Tom Riddle asking Professor Slughorn about Horcruxes during a private conversation. His interest in potion-making is implied through his charm of Slughorn, a man who values rare magical knowledge. Potions symbolize the dark alchemy of Voldemort's soul, the deliberate transformation of something pure into something corrupted. By erasing the aura of difficulty around potions, the films obscure how Voldemort's quest for immortality mirrors the discipline of potion craft: slow, precise, dangerous, and deliberate. The neglect of potion detail also weakens Rowling's moral contrasts. In the novels, potions are morally ambiguous. They can heal or harm, deceive or save. The Polyjuice potion is used by heroes and villains alike. Felix Felicis can bring opportunity but also temptation. This complexity stems from the fact that potions are not casual. They demand effort, making their moral consequences weightier. In the films, where potions seem more like magical shortcuts, the moral gravity of their use lessens. Drinking Felix Felicis feels like a plot device rather than a morally complex choice. When Snape ultimately reveals himself as the Half-Blood Prince, the book's revelation carries weight because readers have seen his genius expressed in those annotated potion notes. He is not merely a cruel teacher, but a mind that innovated within the rigid discipline of potion making. His legacy is written in improved recipes and marginalia, a scientist's trail of insight. The films, by minimizing the science, reduce the significance of this revelation. Snape's brilliance is flattened into another plot twist, rather than the unveiling of a lifelong craftsman's achievement. The cumulative effect of these changes is profound. For book readers, potions are the realm of patience, danger, and respect for process. For film viewers, they are simply props for the plot. The very idea that magic could require time and discipline is sidelined, replaced by cinematic convenience. While films must condense for runtime, in this case the condensation undermines one of Rowling's deepest symbolic threads, that the world of magic, like our own, has rules, and true mastery comes from respecting them. Number 17. Memory charms, permanent or selective amnesia. Of all the spells in the wizarding world, few carry the same mixture of fascination and dread as Obliviate, the charm designed to erase memory. J.K. Rowling described it as a spell of finality, a line that once crossed could never be undone. It is introduced as a weapon of secrecy, used by the Ministry of Magic to keep the Muggle world ignorant of the magical one, and the tone suggests something serious, even irreversible. Yet as the books unfold, and especially in their film adaptations, the spell is bent, stretched, and transformed, depending on the needs of the story. At one moment it is terrifying, capable of destroying identity itself, and in another it becomes a comic mishap, a joke at the expense of a bumbling professor. These contradictions form one of the most overlooked inconsistencies in the entire saga. When Gilderoy Lockhart waves Ron's broken wand in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, the results are absurd. The man who spent his life stealing the deeds of others ends up erasing his own mind. The wand exploded with the force of a small bomb. Harry flung his arms across his face and knew that for the second time in his life he had been saved by pure luck. Lockhart's memory collapses into fragments, leaving him cheerful but empty, incapable of remembering his own fame. At St. Mungo's Hospital later in the series, he is presented as a tragic but almost humorous figure, writing autographs for invisible fans and asking strangers if they are in line for his signature. The audience is invited to laugh at his downfall, but underneath lies the idea that this man has been stripped of the very core of who he was. Contrast this with Hermione Granger's decision in Deathly Hallows to cast Obliviate on her own parents. The scene, particularly in the film, is cold and devastating. She points her wand and whispers the word, and immediately the photographs in the house change. She disappears from family pictures, her existence erased from their minds. Obliviate, she breathes, and with that one word, her parents become new people, convinced they are Monica and Wendell Wilkins, preparing to move to Australia. This is not a comic accident, but a deliberate act of rewriting identity. If Lockhart's memory loss was played for laughs, here it is treated as noble self-sacrifice, yet equally irreversible. The same spell yields two entirely different outcomes, with no explanation for the discrepancy. The book set up Obliviate as permanent. When the Ministry uses it on Muggles who witness magical accidents, there is no suggestion that those memories can ever be restored. Bertha Jorkins, a minor character mentioned in Goblet of Fire, is another example. Her mind was tampered with so heavily that part of her memory was so damaged that it was as good as destroyed, according to Dumbledore. Voldemort, skilled in dark magic, is able to break through the layers, but at the cost of shattering her completely. This paints Obliviate as something brutal, something that risks obliterating the person it touches. And yet Hermione's parents walk away seemingly healthy, happy, and intact, simply minus their daughter. The inconsistency deepens when we consider that Hermione's use of the spell in the book is more ambiguous. Rowling never directly states she casts Obliviate on her parents. Instead, she writes, "I've also modified my parents' memories so that they're convinced they're really called Wendell and Monica Wilkins." The phrasing leaves room to think she used a memory charm in a more controlled sense, not the full destructive force of Obliviate, but the film removes that subtlety, showing her casting Obliviate outright. The problem is that by this point in the story, Obliviate has already been depicted as devastating, so the casualness of Hermione's action feels contradictory. In Lockhart's case, the spell rebounds and erases nearly everything, leaving him unable to function as the man he once was. At St. Mungo's, he shows shallow traces of personality, but none of his history. He is permanently changed, his arrogance and vanity now replaced with vacant politeness. The doctors cannot cure him, and there is no suggestion that his old self will ever return. The narrative treats this as poetic justice. However, if Hermione's parents were subjected to the same power, the result should have been catastrophic. They should have been left as empty shells, stripped not only of their daughter but of the fundamental ability to live coherent lives, and yet they simply carry on, blissfully unaware of the truth their identities reshaped without apparent trauma. The films heighten the contradiction by turning Hermione's act into a visual metaphor. We watch photographs alter themselves, her presence vanishing from every captured memory. This cinematic choice is powerful, but it amplifies the inconsistency. Lockhart did not just forget names or details, his entire identity unraveled. If Obliviate has the strength to erase Hermione from the tangible record of her parents' lives, then logically it should have destroyed their stability too. Instead, the charm becomes elastic, stretched to serve the plot's need for noble sacrifice rather than danger. There is also the question of whether Obliviate is truly selective. The Ministry's use of it suggests some precision. Muggle witnesses forget specific events but continue their lives normally. In Chamber of Secrets, Mr. Weasley mentions that memory charms are often used after magical accidents. This implies a degree of control, but then Bertha Jorkins and Lockhart show the darker side where overuse or misfiring leads to near total destruction of memory. Hermione's parents become the third version. They are not traumatized or fragmented, but simply edited, their reality rewritten with surgical neatness. The spell appears to change its very nature depending on who wields it, or more troubling, depending on what the narrative requires at that moment. Consider also that Hermione is a 17-year-old witch at the time. Even if we accept that she is exceptionally talented, she is not a master of obscure magical branches. Yet she manages to perform memory alteration on a scale that outstrips the Ministry's specialists, rewriting her parents' entire understanding of their lives. Compare this to Lockhart, an adult wizard who supposedly made his career with Obliviate, albeit dishonestly. He mishandles it once and suffers catastrophic consequences. The contrast borders on absurd. The fraudulent professor cannot control the spell he boasts about, while the schoolgirl employs it flawlessly to craft an alternate reality for her family. The danger of memory tampering is underscored repeatedly in the narrative. Dumbledore warns about the fragility of the mind and the dangers of meddling with it. The mind is not a book, to be opened at will and examined at leisure, he tells Harry in Order of the Phoenix. This statement reinforces the sense that memory is delicate, vulnerable to damage, and not something to be altered casually. Yet Hermione's action is written with an almost clinical detachment. There is no collapse, no danger of shattering their psyches, just a silent rewriting. The warning and the example do not align. What emerges from this inconsistency is the sense that Obliviate is a narrative tool rather than a consistent piece of magic. When Rowling needed justice for Lockhart, it became devastating. When she needed to illustrate Hermione's sacrifice, it became precise and merciful. When the Ministry required secrecy, it became efficient and practical. The spell morphs into whatever the story demands, stretching the suspension of disbelief. Readers and viewers rarely pause to reconcile these versions, but the contradictions remain embedded in the fabric of the tale. The difference between book and film only sharpens the confusion. In the novels, there is at least room for interpretation. Hermione may have used a gentler memory modification spell rather than the blunt force of Obliviate. But the films remove that ambiguity, leaving the audience with one word and one spell, Obliviate. To moviegoers, the same spell that turned Lockhart into a shell is the one Hermione uses out of love, producing vastly different consequences. This creates a dissonance that undermines the supposed rules of the magical system. One could argue that intention matters, that Hermione's careful, loving motivation allowed her to guide the spell with precision, while Lockhart's incompetence and broken wand turned it into chaos. Magic, in Rowling's world, often reflects intent and willpower, yet even this explanation falters when we recall Bertha Jorkins, whose memory was not destroyed by incompetence but by deliberate tampering. The line between controlled and catastrophic seems arbitrary, determined more by narrative tone than by consistent magical principles. The selective nature of memory erasure in the story ultimately raises uncomfortable questions. If Hermione could so easily reshape her parents' lives, what prevents the Ministry or any dark wizard from rewriting minds on a massive scale? The book suggests that tampering is dangerous and limited, but Hermione's example proves otherwise. The inconsistency is brushed aside because the act is framed as heroic, but it exposes a gap in the internal logic of the series. Magic that can erase or rewrite the human mind should be one of the most feared forces in the wizarding world. Instead, it slips between comedy, tragedy, and convenience, never staying in one form long enough to solidify. The memory charm stands as one of the clearest examples of the Harry Potter universe bending its own rules. For Lockhart, it was ruin. For Bertha Jorkins, destruction. For Hermione's parents, a clean and reversible sacrifice. It is at once permanent and selective, devastating and harmless. This elasticity reveals the fragile balance between consistent world-building and the demands of storytelling. In the end, Obliviate erases more than memories. It erases the boundaries of its own logic, leaving readers to wonder how much of the magic they can truly trust. Number 18. Scabbers and Animage magic should have been exposed earlier. Under the warm and chaotic atmosphere of the burrow, Scabbers seemed like nothing more than a tired, aging pet rat who had somehow survived the years better than most of his kind. He was often seen napping in Ron Weasley's pocket, nibbling on crumbs at the breakfast table, or scurrying lazily across the floor. Yet hidden within this ordinary creature was Peter Pettigrew, an animagus who had betrayed James and Lily Potter and handed them over to Voldemort. The paradox lies in how a world brimming with magical knowledge and tools capable of revealing hidden truths managed to overlook a man masquerading as a rat for more than a decade. The oversight is glaring once one steps back and compares it against the rules that J.K. Rowling herself established for the wizarding universe. Peter's choice of a rat was clever in a cowardly sense. Rats are creatures that thrive unnoticed, and in the wizarding world they are not uncommon as pets, particularly for children at Hogwarts. Still, the text makes clear that Scabbers was unnaturally old. Ron first acquired him after Percy lost interest in keeping the animal. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, it is pointed out that Scabbers was looking thinner than ever, and did not have a long life left in him. By then, he had already been with the Weasleys for more than 12 years. For a species whose lifespan is rarely more than 3, this fact alone should have set off alarms. Magical families, especially one with children so entrenched in the Hogwarts system, might reasonably have known that something was amiss. And yet the anomaly slipped by without any questions, as though narrative convenience required everyone to turn a blind eye. Consider the broader magical world. There exist experts like Newt Scamander, the famed magizoologist, whose work, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, was a standard Hogwarts textbook. His knowledge and the general awareness of magical creatures suggest that people in the wizarding community were not ignorant of animal biology. A rat living 4 times its natural lifespan while never undergoing a noticeable decline until much later should have raised suspicions. Even ordinary charms might have revealed something strange. Spells such as Revelio are mentioned as methods for unmasking disguised objects and beings. Animagi, by their nature, are human wizards in animal form, not genuine creatures. To believe that no one, neither a teacher at Hogwarts nor an experienced witch or wizard, ever tested Scabbers with a simple charm pushes the boundaries of believability. The Marauder's map, perhaps more than any other magical object, exposes the inconsistency created by Remus Lupin, Sirius Black, James Potter, and Peter Pettigrew himself. It had the extraordinary ability to reveal every person in Hogwarts, no matter their disguise or animagus form. The map did not simply track magical signatures, it recorded names. When Harry first saw it, Fred and George Weasley casually admitted they had used it for years. "This little beauty's taught us more than all the teachers at this school," George proudly remarked in Prisoner of Azkaban. The implication is clear. The map faithfully revealed names walking through the castle. That means Ron's rat would have been consistently labelled not as Scabbers, but as Peter Pettigrew. This detail, once noticed, creates a hole in the logic of the entire series. The map was often in the possession of Fred and George. They were clever, mischievous, and sharp-eyed. Pranking required paying attention to details. If they had seen the name, Peter Pettigrew, sleeping in their brother's bed for years, would they not have asked questions? Even if they did not know who Peter was, surely they would have been puzzled. The surname Pettigrew would not have been familiar to them, but the fact that a strange adult name appeared in the close company of their younger sibling should have raised concern. And yet, the narrative moves forward with no acknowledgement, as if the rules governing the map bent under the pressure of storytelling necessity. The only explanation readers receive is the silence of the twins. But silence does not explain the discrepancy. In reality, their curiosity defined their personalities. They were the ones who uncovered secret passageways and who plotted large-scale pranks under the watchful eye of Argus Filch. For them to ignore a mysterious name night after night seems deeply uncharacteristic. Rowling perhaps underestimated how much attention her readers would give to such details, assuming the humour and mischief of the twins would overshadow the logical gap. But the gap remained, and for attentive fans it stood out like a broken thread in an otherwise carefully woven tapestry. Even more jarring is how Lupin himself overlooked the detail when he later used the map. He was one of its original creators, someone who understood every nuance of its magic. When he confiscated the map from Harry in Prisoner of Azkaban, he acknowledged its power. "I know it. I helped write it. I am Moony." Given this deep familiarity, he must have noticed Peter's name appearing in the castle. Yet he, of all people, who had once trusted Pettigrew as a friend, did not immediately put together that his lost companion was hiding under his nose. The rules of the map demanded that the name appear, and the story demanded that it be ignored until the climax. Narrative convenience once again overshadowed internal consistency. Fans often defend the oversight by suggesting that the twins or Lupin never looked closely enough, or that names on the map blended into the chaos of Hogwarts' hundreds of students. But this feels unsatisfying. Rowling emphasized the map's precision, the way it revealed not just large movements, but tiny ones. Harry saw Severus Snape moving through the corridors. He saw Peter Pettigrew long before anyone explained it to him, and he tracked Draco Malfoy into the room of requirement. The text makes it clear that the map did not blur or generalize, it was specific and accurate. That accuracy undermines the idea that Pettigrew could hide in plain sight. Another overlooked detail is the animagus registration. Rowling notes in interviews and background material that every animagus must be officially registered with the Ministry of Magic. Minerva McGonagall was a registered animagus, and her transformation into a cat was well documented. Pettigrew, however, was unregistered. The Ministry considered this illegal. The very existence of such a rule implies the existence of detection methods. If the Ministry enforced registration, surely they had spells to reveal unregistered transformations. Yet despite Pettigrew's betrayal being known, no one at the Ministry ever considered checking for him through such means. This oversight not only strains logic, but contradicts the world-building that Rowling established. The story of Sirius Black's imprisonment also falters under this scrutiny. He was accused of murdering Pettigrew in broad daylight with only a finger left behind as evidence. The wizarding justice system accepted this without question, sentencing Sirius to Azkaban, but Pettigrew was alive and his animagus form was intact. If the Ministry truly had detection spells for animagi, or if they had been diligent, the deception could have been revealed. Sirius's wrongful imprisonment, while tragic and narratively powerful, depends entirely on the blindness of an entire magical government that otherwise prided itself on strict rules and surveillance. Rowling herself admitted in interviews that the series occasionally bent its own rules. The case of Pettigrew is one of the most striking examples. The longevity of Scabbers, the accuracy of the Marauder's map, the Ministry's laws on animagi, and the natural suspicion of characters like Fred and George all clash with the neat deception that Pettigrew managed. It works dramatically because it delivers one of the greatest twists in the third book, transforming a harmless pet into a traitor who shaped the fate of the wizarding world. But it does so by asking the reader to temporarily suspend the rules already established. This suspension does not ruin the magic of the story, but it invites reflection on the way narratives sometimes prioritize shock value over consistency. The scene in the Shrieking Shack where Pettigrew is finally unmasked is among the most dramatic in the series. Sirius's rage, Lupin's disbelief, and Harry's moral stand against killing Pettigrew all combine into a moment of extraordinary power. Yet this emotional payoff comes at the cost of ignoring the quieter, logical questions that preceded it. How did no one see? How did no one suspect? The answer remains the same, because the story needed it that way. The inconsistencies around Pettigrew highlight a broader truth about fiction. Rules exist until they get in the way of storytelling. Rowling gave her world rich detail and structure, but when a surprise demanded it, the structure bent. Scabbers could live longer than any rat. The map could show names and yet be ignored. The ministry could demand registration yet fail to investigate. Each of these cracks might frustrate the logical reader, but together they also remind us that stories are designed to move us emotionally, not to satisfy every question of logic. And still, readers forgive these contradictions. The betrayal of Pettigrew remains one of the most memorable revelations in the saga. The image of a trembling, pitiful man emerging from the skin of a rat leaves a stronger impression than any technical quibble about magical detection. Rowling trusted her readers to embrace the drama and the shock, even if it meant overlooking the cracks in her own rules. For many, the gamble worked. The emotional resonance outweighed the logical lapse, and the series endured as beloved. But for those who revisit the books with sharper eyes, the cracks remain visible. Every rereading of Prisoner of Azkaban carries the quiet knowledge that Scabbers sitting in Ron's pocket was never just a rat. Every glance at the Marauder's map reminds us that Peter Pettigrew's name was there all along, and every reflection on Sirius's years in Azkaban makes us wonder whether the magical world was willfully blind or simply too trusting of its own flawed rules. In the end, the Pettigrew paradox stands as a reminder that even in the most carefully constructed universes, storytelling sometimes cheats. Number 19. The Triwizard Tournament. Rules that break instantly. Of all the grand events in the wizarding world, the Triwizard Tournament was introduced as something sacred, a tradition older than many of the schools themselves, bound by iron rules and centuries of magical authority. J.K. Rowling makes it clear in The Goblet of Fire that the rules were absolute, one champion per school, chosen by the enchanted goblet, and once chosen, a champion was bound to compete. Professor Dumbledore himself presents the rules as unbendable. The ceremony has weight, atmosphere, even fear surrounding it. Students whisper about the deadly tasks, adults speak of honor and danger in equal measure, and the goblet, blazing blue-white, is treated almost like a holy relic. Yet, in the moment of Harry Potter's selection, the tournament's own foundation collapses. A fourth name appears, an impossibility by the tournament's very nature. And instead of declaring the choice invalid or investigating further, the story accepts the absurdity as if the iron rules were ornamental rather than binding. The tension of that scene is unforgettable. The goblet spits out Fleur Delacour's name first, and she walks gracefully to the front, a champion of bow baton. Then Victor Crumb, the famous Quidditch seeker, is chosen for Durmstrang to the delight of his schoolmates. Finally, Cedric Diggory is named as Hogwarts' rightful champion, and cheers echo through the Great Hall. The balance is perfect. 3 schools, 3 champions, each selected by the impartial magic of the goblet. But then the impossible occurs. A 4th slip of parchment bursts into the air. Harry Potter! The boy himself is stunned, shaking his head, insisting he didn't enter. The professors are baffled, yet within minutes the tone shifts from shock to reluctant acceptance. Mad-Eye Moody mutters about powerful confundus charms, but Dumbledore does not cancel the choice. He does not demand the goblet be corrected. Instead, he declares that Harry must compete, and thus the very thing the rules were supposed to prevent, manipulation and unfairness, becomes the starting point of the tournament. The books themselves underline the binding nature of the selection. Dumbledore says, once a champion is selected by the Goblet of Fire, he or she is obliged to compete. The word obliged suggests no loophole, no possibility of refusal, but the contradiction is clear. If the goblet was bewitched into spitting out a fourth name, then the choice is tainted. It should not carry the same authority as the legitimate three. If anything, it proves the goblet can be manipulated and therefore its decisions are not absolute. In that case, the magical contract Harry is supposedly bound by should not even exist because it was forged by fraud. The paradox is striking. The entire foundation of the Triwizard Tournament is shattered, yet the narrative sweeps past the inconsistency and hurries on to the next spectacle. It becomes stranger when we look at how the adults react. Professors McGonagall, Snape, Karkaroff, Madame Maxime all voice objections, some out of suspicion, some out of anger, but none out of rational logic. Not one of them says, "This choice is invalid, the boy cannot be a champion." Even Barty Crouch Sr., who arrives in his ministry capacity to enforce the rules, declares flatly that Harry must compete. It is as if the system of the tournament is less a set of inviolable magical laws and more a performance, a ritual where everyone agrees to believe in the illusion of inevitability. Rowling paints the goblet as an ancient artifact, yet in this moment it feels fragile, subject to human interpretation. The professors choose to honor the false result not because it is binding, but because they are unwilling to challenge the aura of the tournament itself. This moment is worth examining because of how it redefines the stakes of the story. By making Harry's participation unquestionable, Rowling ensures the narrative moves forward into the thrilling tasks. But from a structural perspective, the Iron Rule collapses at its very introduction. The goblet selection was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of chaos. Dumbledore's insistence that the contract cannot be undone is less an expression of magical law and more of narrative necessity. The rule exists only until it is inconvenient. When the rule threatens to derail the plot, it suddenly becomes flexible. The tournament transforms from a solemn tradition into a stage for drama. Consider how different the tone would be if the adults treated the situation logically. If they said, "This was a fraudulent entry, therefore null and void," then Harry would not compete. The story would need a different engine of conflict. Instead, Rowling chooses spectacle over consistency. This is not a flaw in the sense of careless writing, it is a deliberate sacrifice. The grandeur of a fourth champion, the shock of Harry being dragged into danger against his will, outweighs the cost of bending the established rules. Yet this choice changes how we read the entire tournament. It becomes less about fairness and more about theatre, less about honor, and more about manipulation. Harry's reaction itself shows the absurdity. He repeatedly insists he never put his name in, that he doesn't want to compete. The very fact that the professors know this and that he is underage should be enough to annul the choice. But instead the insistence is that the contract is binding. Barty Crouch Sr. says he is, as of now, obliged to compete. The word echoes with false authority because what Crouch is really defending is not the law but the illusion of the tournament's infallibility. To admit the goblet could be tricked would be to unravel the mystique of the entire event. And so the adults choose denial. They prefer to risk a child's life rather than expose the fragile foundation of their tradition. There is irony in this decision. The Triwizard Tournament was reintroduced to foster cooperation between schools, to encourage unity. Instead, it becomes a stage for deception and suspicion. Karkaroff and Maxime immediately suspect foul play by Dumbledore, assuming Hogwarts somehow manipulated the system to gain 2 champions. In reality, Voldemort's servant Barty Crouch Jr. was behind the scheme. But the irony remains, the safeguards of the goblet were worthless. What should have been a shield against cheating became a weapon in the hands of a dark wizard. And yet, even with this truth in plain sight, the adults cling to the performance. The tournament must go on even if its very foundation is shattered. This contradiction mirrors the way institutions often behave in reality. Traditions are presented as absolute, sacred, beyond question, until they are exposed as fragile human constructs. The Triwizard Tournament becomes an allegory for systems that protect their own prestige at any cost, even at the expense of reason or morality. Dumbledore himself, usually the voice of wisdom, appears complicit in this moment. By choosing not to fight the absurdity, he allows the charade to continue. Harry, only 14, is sacrificed to the narrative of tradition. His life becomes the price of maintaining the tournament's grandeur. One might argue that the binding magical contract itself is the explanation. Perhaps the goblet, once it produced a name, created the bond automatically, regardless of how the name was entered. But this explanation deepens the paradox. If the goblet can be tricked into forming a magical contract with an unwilling participant, then it is not a safeguard, but a liability. Its magic is not wise, but blind. It will honor fraud as easily as truth. The supposed authority of the goblet is therefore meaningless. It becomes nothing more than a machine that obeys the strongest spell regardless of fairness, and yet the adults continue to treat it as sacred. The narrative never returns to question this inconsistency. Once Harry is accepted as a champion, the tasks begin, and the drama of dragons, merpeople, and mazes takes center stage. The tension is too gripping for readers to pause and ask, but why is this tournament still happening if the rules are broken? Rowling uses the spectacle of danger to distract from the logical collapse at the heart of the event. Readers are swept away, too invested in Harry's survival to care about the contradiction. The story succeeds in this sleight of hand, but the cost is clear. The supposed unbreakable rules of the Triwizard Tournament were never truly unbreakable. The film adaptation emphasizes this even more dramatically. Dumbledore's famously out-of-character shout, "Did you put your name in the goblet of fire?" makes the scene chaotic, frantic. The authority of the goblet is treated with almost hysterical reverence, yet the absurdity of its choice is brushed aside with equal hysteria. The visual spectacle of the flaming parchment and the angry headmasters overshadows the logical question. If the goblet can be bewitched so easily, why does anyone still treat its choice as binding? The answer is never given because the story does not want us to linger on the floor. And so, the Triwizard Tournament stands as a striking example of how the Harry Potter series sometimes sacrifices consistency for narrative force. The rules are introduced with grandeur, then shattered in the very moment they are tested. The adults who should demand logic instead cling to the ritual. Harry is forced into danger by fraud, yet the fraud is treated as sacred law. It is a contradiction readers often overlook, swept away by the excitement of the tasks and the thrill of the coming confrontation with Voldemort. But when examined closely, the tournament is less a contest of honor and more a performance built on illusion. This is the paradox at the heart of the Goblet of Fire. The iron rules exist only for ceremony. They give the tournament its aura of tradition, its sense of weight and inevitability. But when the story demands spectacle, the rules are bent, twisted, or ignored. What should have been invalidated is instead celebrated as destiny. And thus the Triwizard Tournament becomes not a triumph of magical law, but a triumph of narrative necessity. Rules made not for justice, but for beauty. Number 20. The Invisibility Cloak, absolute protection. Until it isn't. Of all the magical objects in the Harry Potter saga, few carry the same aura of mystery and reverence as Harry's invisibility cloak. Introduced early in the Philosopher's Stone, it is described not as a simple charmed garment, but as one of the legendary Deathly Hallows. Its enchantment is supposed to be absolute, perfect invisibility, complete protection from sight, unlike the flawed cloaks that fade with time, or the disillusionment charms that still leave ripples and distortions. Dumbledore himself emphasizes its singularity, remarking that it is a true cloak of invisibility, one that does not fray or lose power. Yet, throughout the books, and especially in the films, cracks appear in this supposedly unbreakable enchantment, moments when the cloak's perfection falters, and attentive readers are left wondering whether the narrative itself bends its own rules to serve the story. The first unsettling example comes not from Voldemort or Dumbledore, but from the way the films depict the cloak. In the Philosopher's Stone movie, when Harry sneaks into the restricted section of the library, the camera shows the shimmering outline of the cloak. Its edges ripple like water, glowing faintly, a deliberate choice so that the audience can understand that Harry is still there under the garment. Yet this is a contradiction of the law established in the books. In Rowling's text, the cloak makes its wearer completely unseen, not partially visible. Harry reflects on how extraordinary it feels to vanish entirely, but in the cinematic version, the shimmer suggests imperfection, as though the cloak were merely a trick of light. This cinematic adjustment, made for clarity, inadvertently undermines the artifact's supposed uniqueness and invites the first crack in the illusion of absoluteness. The problem grows sharper in Half-Blood Prince during the tragic scene atop the astronomy tower. In the book, Snape encounters Harry hidden beneath the cloak, frozen by Dumbledore's Petrificus Totalus. Despite the cloak's reputation, Snape somehow seems aware of Harry's presence. Rowling writes, "Snape looked directly into Harry's eyes as he passed. How is this possible if Harry is entirely invisible? The cloak should shield him, yet Snape acts as though Harry's gaze is visible, or at least palpable." Some fans argue that Snape's legilimency allowed him to sense the boy, but Rowling never clarifies. The implication lingers that the cloak's power wavered in a moment when the drama required Harry to be psychologically present at Dumbledore's fall. A further inconsistency appears in the climax of Deathly Hallows. As Harry walks into the forest to meet Voldemort, he carries the cloak but chooses not to wear it. The narrative explains that he wants to face death openly, and this makes sense within the story's emotional arc. Yet later, when Harry lies supposedly dead in Hagrid's arms, Voldemort shows no difficulty in sensing him when he finally awakens. Even earlier in the battle, when Harry does use the cloak to infiltrate the castle, Death Eaters still seem strangely alert to his presence, as though the cloak's legendary shield suddenly offered no defense against the Dark Lord's uncanny awareness. Rowling describes how Voldemort, through the psychic connection, can sense the boy's nearness. The absolute invisibility promised in the Hallows myth is reduced here to mere concealment of form, not essence. One cannot ignore the scene in Prisoner of Azkaban where Professor Moody, later revealed as Barty Crouch Jr., manages to notice Harry under the cloak during a late-night stroll. Moody comments on his ability to see through invisibility cloaks with his magical eye, something Rowling confirms in the text. "That's an invisibility cloak, is it?" he says. "The implication here is dangerous. If the cloak is supposed to be the Deathly Hallow, perfect and unrivaled, why would it fail before an artificial eye? Should not its enchantment have outclassed even this?" Instead, Rowling weakens the legend, suggesting that human craftsmanship can pierce what was supposedly a gift from Death himself. The contradiction deepens with Dumbledore himself. In Deathly Hallows, Harry learns that Dumbledore borrowed the cloak from James Potter years before. Studying it with fascination, he concluded that this cloak was extraordinary, unlike any he had seen. Yet this same Dumbledore, throughout the series, often appears to know where Harry is, even when the boy wears the cloak. In Goblet of Fire, when Harry sneaks into Hogsmeade under the cloak, it is Dumbledore who later recalls his presence. Readers are left to speculate whether this is omniscient wisdom, legilimency, or simply narrative convenience. The cloak bends again to the needs of the plot. What is striking is how often Rowling herself insists on the absolute nature of the Hallows. In the tale of the three brothers, the third brother survives death's pursuit only because of the cloak's unassailable power. And Death searched for many years but was never able to find him. The fable makes it clear nothing should pierce the protection of the cloak. Yet when Harry is at Hogwarts, the cloak falters before Moody's eye, Snape's suspicion, and Voldemort's psychic tether. The myth collapses under the weight of these contradictions. The films exacerbate the problem not only by showing the shimmering edges, but by allowing characters to brush against or sense the cloak's outline. In Chamber of Secrets, when Harry and Ron sneak into Hagrid's hut, the camera lingers on how the cloak slips slightly, revealing shoes. Such visual cues are cinematic necessities, but they reframe the cloak as fallible. This directly opposes the narrative built around its legendary perfection. For viewers unfamiliar with the books, the cloak seems merely a clever tool, not the embodiment of Death's gift. Perhaps the most puzzling contradiction occurs in Deathly Hallows when Harry, Ron, and Hermione are captured by Snatchers. The cloak is mentioned, but at critical moments it seems to offer no help. Rowling skirts around its use, sometimes failing to explain why it isn't worn. The narrative depends on the trio being caught, so the cloak must be set aside. But in doing so, the integrity of the Hallows mythology is once again compromised. An object meant to represent immortality and inevitability becomes instead a prop adjusted for tension. Even the Marauder's map complicates the story. The map shows names and footprints regardless of cloaks or spells. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry sees Peter Pettigrew's name on the map, though the man is hidden as a rat. This detail undermines the cloak's absoluteness. If the map can reveal someone under it, then the cloak does not make the wearer untraceable. Yet the Deathly Hallows legend insists otherwise. Rowling herself acknowledges this tension in interviews, admitting that the map is one of the series' loose ends. One might argue that the contradictions highlight the cloak's symbolic rather than literal power. It is less about absolute concealment than about Harry's relationship with death and destiny, but Rowling does not write it that way. She gives the cloak lore a history, a place in the myth of the Hallows. Readers are told explicitly that it is not like any other cloak, that it is flawless. When the story bends those rules, letting Moody's eyes see through it, letting Voldemort sense Harry, the suspension of disbelief falters. The magic becomes inconsistent, the artifact less sacred. Consider again the astronomy tower. Snape's awareness of Harry beneath the cloak shatters the supposed rule that no magic can see through it. Rowling never clarifies this moment, leaving readers to debate whether it was coincidence, legilimency, or narrative necessity. But the truth remains, in the climactic death of Dumbledore, the cloak is silent, impotent. Its purpose is to shield, yet it does not. In that silence lies one of the story's deepest contradictions. Even Harry himself at times seems uncertain about the cloak's true capacity. He wonders whether it could have saved his parents, whether it might protect him against Voldemort, whether it is truly unique. His doubts mirror the reader's growing unease as the series progresses. The more the cloak is used, the more fragile its supposed perfection becomes. Each inconsistency chips away at the myth until by the end it feels less like a hallow and more like an accessory of convenience. The most generous interpretation is that Rowling wanted the cloak to operate on symbolic rather than literal terms. Death may have given the third brother protection from the inevitability of time, but no enchantment can prevent love, betrayal, or destiny from finding its way. Still, the text itself promises more than metaphor. Dumbledore's words, as the fable's tale, and Harry's own awe paint the cloak as an unbreakable miracle. The films, the contradictions, and the narrative loopholes tell another story, that even the most absolute magic can crumble when the demands of drama require it. Thus the invisibility cloak stands as both one of Rowling's greatest inventions and one of her most inconsistent creations. It is the gift of death himself, yet pierced by a magical eye. It is perfect concealment, yet undone by Snape's glance and Voldemort's intuition. It is an eternal artifact, yet betrayed by the shimmer of a film's special effect. In the end, its contradictions reveal more than its powers. They reveal the tension between myth and narrative, between the absolute and the necessary, between the promise of flawless magic and the reality of flawed storytelling. Number 21, Hogwarts architecture, a castle that constantly changes. Hogwarts has always been more than a castle. In J.K. Rowling's books, it breathes with the pulse of ancient magic, stubborn and unyielding to time, yet consistent in its foundations. The moving staircases were famously described in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. There were 142 staircases at Hogwarts, some wide and sweeping, others narrow and rickety, some that led somewhere different on a Friday. This whimsical instability is part of the school's charm, but it is always bounded by an underlying permanence. The walls remain where they should be, towers loom eternally against the Scottish sky, and the Great Hall never slides into a different wing overnight. For the reader, the castle is alive but dependable, an enchanted labyrinth where danger lurks but geography remains knowable. The films, however, chose a different path. Each installment reimagined the structure of Hogwarts as if the production designers were themselves adding magic to the stone, erasing courtyards and summoning bridges at will. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, the castle suddenly reveals a long stone bridge jutting into the abyss, a dramatic structure that had never appeared in the Philosopher's Stone or the Chamber of Secrets. Its existence is never explained. Was it always there, hidden behind a veil of invisibility? Did Dumbledore commission new architecture over the summer holidays? Of course, the answer is simpler. The filmmakers desired cinematic grandeur, a frame that would lend itself to sweeping aerial shots and perilous duels. But for the devoted fan, the question lingers. How did Harry and his friends adapt to a Hogwarts that reinvented itself each September? The contrast is even sharper when one remembers Rowling's meticulous consistency. In The Goblet of Fire, she carefully situates the Beauxbaton carriage landing by the edge of the lake near the Forbidden Forest. She notes the carriage's descent with a muffled thud in a swirl of glittering snow. The imagery depends on Hogwarts' recognizable grounds, the lake, the forest, the castle in its eternal place. Yet the fourth film presents a completely reshaped exterior, with towers rearranged like chess pieces, courtyards enlarged, and staircases leading to balconies that had never existed before. The Beauxbaton's arrival becomes visually magnificent, but it belongs to a Hogwarts that would be unrecognizable to the children who had already lived there for 3 years. Consider the shifting placement of Hagrid's hut. In the books it lies at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, close enough for Harry and Hermione to reach in a hurry. Rowling specifies in The Prisoner of Azkaban that they hurried across the lawn past the vegetable patch and knocked frantically at the door. The geography is clear, a short dash from the castle to the hut. But the films, particularly from the third movie onward, move Hagrid's dwelling down a steep slope, separated by winding paths and rocky terrain. The climb adds cinematic tension, especially when Buckbeak's execution looms or when Harry and Hermione dash through the night, yet it undermines the textual certainty, making one wonder how students in the earlier films failed to notice that their favourite gamekeeper's home had shifted several hundred yards downhill. The Great Hall itself exemplifies this duality. On the page, Rowling describes it with faithful precision. The walls were lit with thousands and thousands of candles. The ceiling was a velvety black, dotted with stars. It is always rectangular, always vast, always at the heart of student life. In the first 2 films, Christopher Columbus remained loyal to this vision, grounding the hall in an accessible layout. But by the later films, its adjoining spaces began to warp. Corridors appeared where none had been, and exits led to unfamiliar courtyards. The hall remained the same in essence, but its relationship to the rest of the castle grew increasingly unstable, as though each director had been given a new puzzle to arrange. Perhaps the most striking example comes from the Half-Blood Prince. In the book, Dumbledore and Harry leave the castle together by apparating from within the boundaries of Hogwarts, an extraordinary act that shocks Harry because it should be impossible, Dumbledore explains. Being me has its privileges. This only works because the castle's geography and magical protections are firmly established. Yet in the film, they stroll onto the mysterious rock bridge, framed against the mountains, and disapparate dramatically into the night. The moment loses its textual shock, instead highlighting again the bridge that appeared. From nowhere, serving narrative spectacle at the expense of Rowling's carefully built rules, the Quidditch pitch tells a similar story. In the first two films, it appears as a towering structure of wooden stands closely resembling Rowling's description in the Philosopher's Stone. There were 100 rows of seats, each higher than the last. But the Prisoner of Azkaban repositions it entirely, moving it far into the valley below the castle, with the surrounding landscape altered to dramatic cliffs. It is as if Hogwarts architects had raised the original structure and rebuilt it in a new location during the summer holidays. Fans who track such details cannot help but ask, how did Oliver Wood train his team on one pitch, only to find the entire stadium relocated by the next school year? The Room of Requirement, introduced in The Order of the Phoenix, complicates matters even further. Rowling presents it as a magical anomaly, hidden along the 7th floor corridor, accessible only when needed. It is a room that a person may enter when they have real need of it, Dobby explains to Harry. This exception to stability feels deliberate, a contrast to the otherwise fixed architecture. But in the films, the entire section of castle where the room exists shifts shape between scenes. Long Gothic corridors extend in directions inconsistent with earlier shots. Staircases emerge that contradict the earlier layout. The uniqueness of the Room of Requirement becomes diluted, since much of the castle seems to behave like it. The library, too, suffers from cinematic reimagination. Rowling writes in The Chamber of Secrets, "The library was a place Harry had always loved. Thousands of books, hundreds of narrow aisles. Its placement is never in doubt. It is near the classrooms, close to the central heart of Hogwarts. But in the films, the library transforms in size, depth, and even placement of entrances. At times, it looks like a small study chamber. At others, an immense cathedral of books." Hermione's diligent research, already difficult due to the strict rules of Madame Pince, becomes even more bewildering when one imagines she must relearn the floor plan each year. One might argue that this cinematic inconsistency mirrors the chaotic magic of Hogwarts itself. After all, Rowling does describe staircases that move, doors that pretend to be walls, and trick steps that trap the careless. But the difference is that in the books, these are magical quirks within a stable structure. The core of the castle does not change. Neville Longbottom may get stuck in a step, but he never finds that the staircase has moved from one tower to another entirely. The films, by contrast, shift the very skeleton of Hogwarts, asking viewers to suspend disbelief far beyond the enchantments Rowling herself imagined. The problem becomes more acute when one remembers how deeply place matters in the narrative. In the Chamber of Secrets, Harry and Ron use Polyjuice potion to infiltrate the Slytherin common room. Rowling describes them travelling down to the dungeons guided by Draco Malfoy. The geography is crucial. Slytherin is underground, Hufflepuff near the kitchens, Gryffindor high in the tower. These placements echo the personalities of the houses, rooting identity in location. Yet the films give us only fragmented glimpses, with staircases and doors shifting in ways that make it impossible to build a mental map. The symbolism of the houses anchored in space is lost in the pursuit of ever-changing cinematic drama. One cannot forget the sudden appearance of the clock tower. Absent from the early films, it emerges suddenly in The Prisoner of Azkaban as a monumental structure complete with swinging pendulum and immense courtyard. Later movies treat it as integral, using its tower for duels, its courtyard for battles, but in Rowling's books the clock tower is mentioned only fleetingly, never as central geography. Its invention by filmmakers enriches the visual splendor, but disrupts continuity. How could Harry and Hermione have walked past such a looming structure for 2 years without notice? The inconsistencies might be dismissed as artistic license, yet they carry consequences for storytelling. In the Deathly Hallows, the Battle of Hogwarts depends on geography. Rowling crafts the sequence with clarity. Giants attacking from the grounds, Death Eaters surging through the front gates, defenders rallying in the Great Hall. This spatial awareness grounds the reader in chaos. But in the films, the shifting architecture makes the battle more confusing. The iconic bridge collapses in flames, a moment of visual triumph, but one that exists only in the cinematic Hogwarts, not in Rowling's. For readers who imagined a stable battlefield, the movie offers a different castle altogether. What remains fascinating is how many viewers never questioned this shifting architecture. Each new film presented its Hogwarts, and audiences embraced the spectacle, rarely pausing to compare layouts. The emotional pull of the story overshadowed the inconsistencies. Yet for careful fans, the shifting castle stands as one of the clearest examples of how the films broke the rules of the world Rowling so carefully established. The staircases were meant to move, yes, but not the entire fortress. Hogwarts was alive, but not fickle, enchanted, but not redesigned at the whim of each director. It was the eternal home of witches and wizards, and it should have remained so, year after year. Number 22, The Big Battles. Where are all the adult wizards? The final battle for Hogwarts was portrayed as a decisive clash between good and evil, a moment where the fate of the wizarding world hung by a fragile thread. Yet when one begins to peel back the layers of this grand scene, both in the book and in the film adaptation, a curious paradox becomes clear. The battle is meant to be the culmination of years of hidden conflict, but the number of participants raises uncomfortable questions. If the wizarding world of Britain is truly composed of thousands of witches and wizards, then why does the climactic fight feel so small, so limited, so strangely enclosed within the castle walls? From the very beginning, Rowling establishes that the magical community is not minuscule. Diagon Alley teems with life. The Quidditch World Cup reveals a vast and vibrant population, and St. Mungo's Hospital alone suggests a sizable society in need of medical care. When Harry attends the Quidditch World Cup in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, he is awestruck by the sheer scale of the event. Thousands of witches and wizards gather to cheer for their teams, filling an enchanted stadium so vast that it dwarfs any school in size. The text describes it vividly. Rows and rows of seats rose in a circular formation around the field, enough to seat 100,000 wizards. Goblet of Fire. This scale makes it undeniable that Britain's magical population was far larger than what appeared at Hogwarts during its darkest hour. And yet in the Deathly Hallows, when Voldemort finally lays siege to Hogwarts, the defenders are surprisingly few. We see professors like McGonagall, Flitwick and Sprout taking charge, students rallying bravely despite their youth, and a handful of Order members joining the cause. Kingsley Shacklebolt, Lupin, Tonks and Arthur Weasley are all present, and later Aberforth Dumbledore lends unexpected support. The film intensifies the scene with cinematic grandeur, but the head count remains small compared to what we know exists in the wizarding population. Even Voldemort's army feels oddly limited despite his reputation for gathering legions of followers. This imbalance leaves the impression that the world shrank at the exact moment it should have expanded. It is especially striking when one recalls that in the Order of the Phoenix, the Ministry dispatched a formidable contingent of wizards to Hogwarts in an attempt to seize control. Dolores Umbridge was backed by auras, bureaucrats, and political authority. When Fudge arrives after Dumbledore's duel with Voldemort, he is flanked by numerous officials. Clearly, the Ministry could muster dozens of trained wizards at short notice. Yet in the climactic battle, after the Ministry falls, why does that same apparatus not splinter into rebel factions to stand with the Order. Surely many witches and wizards detested Voldemort enough to fight, and yet only fragments of society seem to appear, as if the rest simply vanished when the story demanded intimacy. The paradox becomes even sharper when comparing the Battle of Hogwarts to earlier gatherings in the story. Consider the rescue mission at the Department of Mysteries. Harry and his 5 friends from Dumbledore's army clash with 12 Death Eaters, and then the Order rushes in with reinforcements. Lupin, Sirius, Moody, Tonks and Kingsley all appear, and the confrontation is chaotic, dangerous, and sprawling across the halls of the Ministry. This relatively small-scale skirmish already feels crowded with named characters and clear stakes. By contrast, the supposed war-ending battle sometimes feels strangely thin, with long stretches where only a handful of names dominate the chaos. One explanation may lie in Rowling's storytelling approach. She often frames the narrative through Harry's perspective, and Harry is rarely positioned to view the entire battlefield. When McGonagall orders the castle's defences to rise, statues coming to life, spells sealing corridors, and teachers preparing their wards, Harry sees only fragments of the larger plan. The prose reinforces this limited view. He was one of hundreds, and yet to his relief he felt not as though he had been abandoned, but as though he was part of a great army, the whole school united for a common end. Deathly Hallows. The moment is emotionally powerful, but when read carefully, the phrase hundreds feels strikingly small. If Hogwarts itself has a student body in the hundreds, then perhaps only a few additional allies swelled the ranks. For a war that was supposed to involve thousands of magical citizens, the scene feels disproportionately narrow. The films only magnify this discrepancy. The Battle of Hogwarts is staged with crumbling towers, surging giants, and endless explosions of green and red light. Still, the sheer number of fighters is curiously low. Viewers can count clusters of defenders clashing with scattered Death Eaters, but the battle never grows to the size of the stadium at the Quidditch World Cup. The contradiction becomes hard to ignore. The wizarding world, once so populous and full of life, suddenly compresses to a few dozen recognizable figures and anonymous extras for an audience. Immersed in the world for years, the shrinking of scale is both practical for the story and oddly unsatisfying. There are, of course, diegetic explanations that fans have proposed. Many witches and wizards may have chosen to hide, fearful of Voldemort's brutality. Others might have been intimidated, coerced, or too isolated to reach Hogwarts in time. Voldemort's control over the Ministry might have paralyzed communication, making coordination difficult. These are logical defenses of the text, but they do not fully resolve the contradiction. If the Order of the Phoenix could smuggle Harry out of Privet Drive under the nose of the Death Eaters, surely a network existed that could have called hundreds to Hogwarts. If Aberforth could summon help from the Hog's Head via the secret passage, why not broader reinforcements from across the country? The absence becomes even more glaring when considering Voldemort's strategy. As a self-proclaimed Dark Lord intent on ruling Britain, he would surely have wanted to display overwhelming force at Hogwarts. Yet while he does command giants, dementors, and a host of Death Eaters, the numbers feel closer to a raiding party than a conquering army. Compare this with the mass of witches and wizards seen at the Quidditch World Cup, or even at Dumbledore's funeral in The Half-Blood Prince, where hundreds of people, some of them weeping openly, lined the path. Half-Blood Prince. The contrast suggests that Rowling intentionally kept the battle confined, but at the expense of internal consistency. It is also telling that characters like Slughorn, who eventually returns to fight, had to be personally persuaded. Slughorn's absence until the later stages of the battle reflects a wider apathy among adults in the magical world, a passivity that seems at odds with the supposed life and death struggle. Where were the countless unnamed auras, healers, and ministry officials who might have despised Voldemort? Where were the older generations of Hogwarts graduates who surely owed their skills and loyalty to the school that had raised them? The silence of this wider world cast the battle in a strangely enclosed light, as though the fate of the wizarding world rested solely on a small band of teenagers and their mentors. Rowling's choice, however, does carry narrative weight. By constraining the battle, she ensures that readers remain emotionally attached to characters they know. If the field had been crowded with thousands of strangers, the intimacy of Fred Weasley's death, Tonks and Lupin's fall, or Harry's confrontation with Voldemort might have been diluted. The battle is not about numbers, it is about faces we recognize, voices we remember, and sacrifices that hurt because they are personal. Yet this artistic choice does not erase the nagging paradox of scale. A world too large to fit into Hogwarts halls suddenly seems to fold in on itself, reducing its complexity for the sake of a story climax. The paradox also speaks to a deeper tension in the series between world-building and storytelling. Rowling created a society rich with detail, bustling with institutions, traditions, and a population large enough to support international tournaments. But when the story demanded war, she drew the focus inward, collapsing the global scale into the personal. The result is a battle that resonates emotionally but feels oddly small when compared to the magnitude of the stakes. It is as though the wizarding world, so vast in earlier volumes, became a stage set, populated only by those who mattered directly to Harry. Some fans defend this as a reflection of reality. In times of terror, most people do not take up arms. They hide, they wait, they hope to survive. The silence of the wider wizarding population may be Rowling's grim commentary on human nature, on the reluctance of societies to confront evil until forced. This interpretation has merit, but the text itself does not emphasize this theme. Instead, it reads more like a structural necessity, a decision to keep the story manageable rather than an exploration of cowardice or apathy. That is why the absence feels more like a break in internal logic than a deliberate moral lesson. The Battle of Hogwarts, then, becomes both powerful and puzzling. It delivers the emotional catharsis readers craved, but at the cost of consistency. We know from earlier chapters that the wizarding world is vast, and we know from previous events that it can gather in great numbers. Yet when it mattered most, that same world shrank, leaving only a few hundred to stand against Voldemort. It is a contradiction hidden by the intensity of the story, a detail many overlooked in the rush of emotion, but one that lingers upon reflection. The scale of the world and the scale of the war never quite align, leaving a shadow across the saga's grand finale. Number 23, The Power of Love, Absolute Protection, until it gets inconvenient. Of all the mysteries in J.K. Rowling's universe, few shine brighter than the power of Lily Potter's sacrifice. In the very first book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the reader is told that love, pure, selfless love, formed a shield around Harry. Dumbledore assures Harry that Voldemort could not touch him because his mother's choice to die for him left a mark, no visible scar, but still as strong as any magic. It is a breathtaking moment, offering hope that something deeper than spells and wands governs the wizarding world. But the beauty of this lore begins to unravel as the series progresses. What was once described as an unbreakable protection starts to feel like a narrative tool that appears or disappears depending on what the story needs. When Voldemort returns in Goblet of Fire, the reader expects this shield to still stand between Harry and the Dark Lord. Yet the Triwizard Graveyard scene shows Voldemort gripping Harry's face and inflicting pain without any resistance. The only force that saves Harry is the twin cause of their wands, not Lily's sacrifice. The idea that Voldemort's mere touch should burn him, as it once did in Philosopher's Stone, seems forgotten. The audience is left asking why this protection vanishes at the precise moment Harry needs it most. Wasn't the premise that Voldemort could never harm him through physical touch? By the time Order of the Phoenix arrives, the inconsistency becomes glaring. The connection between Harry and Voldemort is described as a two-way bridge, full of visions and painful intrusions into Harry's mind. Voldemort's influence grows stronger sending Harry searing images of corridors in the Ministry and dreams that feel like possession. If Lily's love created a barrier against the Dark Lord, why does it allow him such freedom inside Harry's head? The same books remind us that when Voldemort possessed Harry's body, he suffered from agony so great that he withdrew. Rowling herself writes, "His pain was Voldemort's pain, that it was agony to him to touch a soul so full of love." Yet this is presented as an isolated scene rather than a consistent rule. The love shield burns Voldemort once, but somehow it does not stop him from attacking Harry again and again through visions. The problem deepens in Half-Blood Prince when Dumbledore explains the terms of the protection. As long as Harry can call the Dursleys' house home, he says, the blood of his mother will safeguard him. The catch is oddly specific. Harry must return each summer to renew the protection. It suddenly reduces the universality of Lily's sacrifice to something conditional, tied to mundane technicalities of residence. The great cosmic law of love now resembles a legal contract. It is difficult not to notice how the interpretation changes depending on what Rowling wants to emphasize. At first, it is absolute. Later, it is bureaucratic. The climax of inconsistency arrives in Deathly Hallows. Here, Harry himself offers the ultimate sacrifice by walking into the Forbidden Forest to meet his death. This echoes Lily's choice, and Rowling frames it as a parallel. "I was ready to die to stop you hurting these people," Harry tells Voldemort after returning from the forest. And suddenly this act spreads protection not just over Harry, but over every single person fighting in Hogwarts. None of Voldemort's spells hit with their full force. The shield expands beyond one child to hundreds. The question is inevitable. Why did no one invoke this before? If love can radiate like a dome of immunity, could others not have laid down their lives in sacrifice to save entire groups? This final stretch of narrative leaves the reader torn. On the one hand, it is profoundly moving to see Harry's courage echoed in a supernatural reward. On the other hand, it undermines the rules established earlier. Why did Lily's death not protect James or Sirius or anyone else present that fateful night? Why could Dumbledore not warn others about this reproducible magic? Rowling seems to want the emotional resonance of sacrifice without being tied to the internal logic of her world. The story soars in feeling but stumbles in coherence. One striking inconsistency occurs in the graveyard duel of Goblet of Fire. Voldemort touches Harry's scar, causing searing pain, yet he grips Harry's face without bursting into flames. In Philosopher's Stone, Quirrell burns alive when attempting the same. The text makes it clear. Quirrell rolled off him, his face blistering, and Harry's hands itched where they had touched him. Why does this law of protection vanish entirely once Voldemort has a body again? The shield is supposed to be about Voldemort himself, not Quirrell. And if Voldemort through Quirrell could not touch Harry in year 1, how can he caress Harry's scar with no consequence in year 4? It is tempting to see this as part of Rowling's larger approach. The laws of magic bend whenever the story demands drama. The power of love is emphasized when it creates a poetic climax: Quirrell's death, Voldemort's retreat from possession, Harry's victory in the forest. But in moments where the narrative requires Harry to suffer, the shield conveniently flickers off. This selective application turns what should be the deepest lore of the series into a plot device. The promise that love conquers all is compelling, but only when it does not interfere with suspense. The use of the connection between Harry and Voldemort as a narrative window is especially contradictory. Readers are told that Voldemort cannot endure love, that he cannot bear the warmth inside Harry's heart. Yet entire books rely on Voldemort peering through that very heart to spy and manipulate. The story even warns Harry not to close his mind too tightly for fear of missing useful information. If the shield of love were truly active, Voldemort's vision should have destroyed him from the inside. Instead, they serve as the mechanism for advancing the plot. Love becomes both poison and door depending on the chapter. The emotional weight of the shield, however, keeps readers invested. It is difficult not to be swept away by the moment Harry gives his life, allowing Neville, Hermione, and the others to continue the fight. When Rowling writes, he was going to meet death, and it would be quick, and it would be easy, and it would mean nothing compared to the people he loved, the idea that this choice changes everything feels earned. Yet, in retrospect, one wonders why other heroes, Dumbledore for instance, who certainly chose to sacrifice himself, did not create similar shields. Did his death not ripple outward to protect Harry? Why does the magic appear only when the narrative craves a grand finale? There is also the question of Voldemort's knowledge. If he feared love so much, why did he not seek ways to neutralize it? Dumbledore insists repeatedly that love is Voldemort's greatest weakness. And yet Voldemort touches Harry in Goblet of Fire, infiltrates him in Order of the Phoenix, and curses him in the forest with apparent ease until the final twist reveals otherwise. The Dark Lord acts as though the shield barely matters. If the law were consistent, Voldemort should have been paralyzed by Harry's mere presence, unable to duel him with such regularity. The inconsistency does not erase the emotional truth that readers cling to. Love, in its purest form, is meant to be stronger than hate. It is a theme as old as myth, one that resonates across cultures. Yet within Rowling's crafted rules of magic, it swings between law and loophole. The protection is invincible in one chapter, fragile in the next. It leaves the impression that Rowling is writing with her heart rather than her blueprint. She knows the image she wants to create, the boy shielded by love, the mother's arms outstretched, the son repeating the act, but she allows the mechanics to blur. For fans who analyze the series closely, these contradictions are difficult to ignore. Entire essays and debates have been dedicated to reconciling why Lily's sacrifice behaved one way with Quirrell, another with Voldemort's possession, and yet another in the Battle of Hogwarts. Some argue that the love shield is symbolic rather than literal, that it manifests differently depending on the threat. Others accept it as a flaw in continuity, but in either case, the principle that should have been the most stable in the series feels unstable. It becomes less a law of magic than a storytelling convenience. What remains powerful, despite the contradictions, is the reader's response. When Harry steps into the forest, when Voldemort recoils from possessing him, when Quirrell burns under Lily's invisible shield, the theme resonates. The fact that it does not fit together perfectly is less important than the emotional catharsis it provides. Yet for those who demand internal consistency, the cracks are wide. Love as protection is either the foundation stone of the saga or a wobbly scaffold erected whenever needed. It is absolute when the story demands hope, but porous when it demands tension. And so the tale of Harry Potter carries within it both brilliance and fragility. The brilliance is the poetic vision of love as a magic deeper than spells. The fragility is the wavering application of that vision. Readers who lose themselves in the story may never question why the shield works on one page and not the next. Those who linger, however, find themselves asking why Rowling gave the world a law only to bend it when convenient. In the end, the power the Dark Lord knows not is both the most beautiful and the most inconsistent force in the wizarding world. Number 24, Expelliarmus, a simple spell that becomes the ultimate weapon. Of all the spells that appear in J.K. Rowling's world, none carries such a paradox as Expelliarmus. Introduced in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets as a beginner's disarming charm, it is described simply as knocking an opponent's wand from their grasp. Professor Snape uses it against Lockhart in the Dueling Club, and the effect is almost comic. Yet by the time Harry faces Voldemort in Deathly Hallows, this same spell has transformed into the ultimate weapon, capable not just of disarming, but of ending the greatest battle in wizarding history. How did a simple red flash become more powerful than curses designed to maim, kill, or incapacitate? The inconsistency reveals one of the strangest contradictions of the saga. The rules of magic bend, sometimes silently, to narrative needs. Harry first adopts Expelliarmus as a kind of personal shield in Prisoner of Azkaban. During the confrontation in the Shrieking Shack when he faces Sirius Black and Remus Lupin, the spell is his instinctive choice. Rowling notes, Harry raised his wand and shouted, "Expelliarmus!" The blast not only knocks Lupin's wand away, but sends both Sirius and Lupin reeling. This is already a departure from the original description. The spell does not just make the wand fly, it pushes the victim backward with visible force. In a sense, it begins to blur the line between disarming charm and stunning spell, but the text does not dwell on this. Readers are swept away in the intensity of the moment, barely noticing that the magic is suddenly more versatile than before. The Triwizard Tournament cements Expelliarmus as Harry's instinctive weapon. When he and Cedric Diggory are attacked by Victor Crumb under the Imperious Curse, Harry once again cries out the familiar incantation. The result is not merely that Crumb drops his wand, it knocks him unconscious. Cedric remarks with relief, "You were brilliant, Harry." The scene is brief, but its implications are vast. How can a defensive spell meant for beginners achieve what requires an advanced, stunning spell like Stupefy? The rules seem forgotten. Either the magic grows stronger in Harry's hands, or Rowling quietly adjusts its effect to maintain Harry's character arc as someone who refuses to use darker curses yet still survives against formidable threats. By the time of Order of the Phoenix, the charm has transformed into Harry's dueling identity. During the climactic battle at the Department of Mysteries, Harry repeatedly hurls Expelliarmus at Death Eaters, and the narrative depicts it as his central strategy. He shouts it against Lucius Malfoy, against Antonin Dolohov, and even in moments of desperation when cornered. The text often shows opponents flying backward, dropping to the ground, or being momentarily incapacitated. In contrast, other characters employ hexes that burn, curse, or stun, yet Harry clings to his one charm. Readers are reminded of Sirius Black's death, where Harry attempts to use the same spell against Bellatrix, only to be outmaneuvered. The irony is heavy. Harry chooses a schoolbook spell in a battle where lethal curses fly, and it both limits and defines him. Rowling clearly intends the choice to reflect Harry's morality, but it simultaneously shifts the weight of magical rules. What was once a classroom exercise has become his battle cry. Dumbledore himself reinforces this contradiction. In Half-Blood Prince, when Harry nearly uses Sectum Sempra on Malfoy, the headmaster warns him about dabbling in dangerous spells, yet Dumbledore never criticizes Harry's reliance on Expelliarmus. On the contrary, he frames it as a virtue. When Harry insists on using it during lessons with the Dumbledore's army, his peers mock the simplicity of the spell. Still, Harry defends it passionately, recalling Snape's demonstration years. It's always useful to disarm your opponent. Rowling subtly sanctifies the charm, turning it into a symbol of restraint and integrity. However, this moral elevation collides with the logic of the magical system. If wizards had such a reliable, non-lethal spell that could also incapacitate, why would anyone resort to darker magic at all? The internal consistency phrase. The most striking moment arrives in Deathly Hallows, when Harry duels Stan Shunpike, the bewitched conductor of the night bus, in the skies over Little Whinging. Surrounded by Death Eaters, Harry reflexively uses Expelliarmus. Lupin later scolds him. That was a very, very foolish thing to do. If I'm right, and you used your signature spell, then you might as well have shouted, "Here I am." This exchange acknowledges the peculiarity head-on. Harry has become so identified with this one charm that enemies can track him by it. The contradiction deepens, for if Expelliarmus is so predictable, why does Harry not diversify? Rowling seems determined to tie Harry's identity inseparably to this spell. Narrative consistency be damned, the Battle of the Seven Potters emphasizes the same theme. When Harry and Voldemort clash mid-air, Harry's instinctive use of Expelliarmus meets Voldemort's Avada Kedavra. Wands connect, Priori Incantatem re-emerges, and Harry survives. The mechanics of this duel twist reality itself. A beginner's spell collides with the most forbidden curse, and the result is a magical stalemate that only makes sense if destiny itself bends the laws, the rules of combat once clear. Certain spells kill, others disarm, have dissolved into narrative poetry. The spell is no longer just a charm, it is a symbol of defiance, love, and resistance. Yet from a structural point of view, the internal rules of the magical world buckle under the weight of symbolism.